The philosophers regarded the concept of freedom in a way that perhaps is different to many people in the West today. Plato regarded freedom as the control of the mind. Freedom is about the logos, the themos, and the epistemia, the desires kept in check, the spirit supporting reason, the logos governing the soul. And the Aristotle, meanwhile, saw freedom as a life lived in accordance with virtue. Freedom is not the absence of restraint, but the ability to act within the context of the goal of being good. Human flourishing, eudaimonia, is the highest form of freedom, which is living a life of virtue where reason governs our actions. And political freedom, true freedom, exists only within the well-ordered polis, within the political life of the city-state, where laws encourage virtue and citizens participate in the control of government. And Aristotle was somebody who believed that some people were natural slaves and therefore lacked the rational capacity for true freedom, for embracing true freedom. Now, I think that's something to pick up, isn't it? Thomas Aquinas, regarded freedom in a sort of Aristotelian way as the order towards the good. Humans are free when they act, only when they act in accordance with their ultimate purpose, their telos, their direction, which is God. And that means acting in the context of God's eternal law, natural law, human law, divine law. True freedom is in choosing one path. You are free to choose, but only to choose that, to choose the good, which means aligning one's will with God's will. And sin is a loss of freedom. Acting against virtue is to act against your absolute freedom. So when you come to J.D. Vance, J.D. Vance has his own understanding of freedom, and he sees freedom as something which is denied in Britain, the retreat of free speech in Britain. And speaking at the Munich Security Conference, he declared the greatest threat to Europe was not from Russia or China, but from within, namely the erosion of democracy, the stifling of dissent, and the inability of governments to listen to their own people. But does Vance have a point? Is Britain a land where free speech has been shackled, or is this an overly simplistic reading of a complex landscape? One of Vance's key assertions today is that Britain has embraced a culture of policing speech, whether through legal mechanisms or more insidiously through social and corporate coercion. Examples of individuals facing legal action for prayer outside an abortion clinic, police investigating social media posts under the guise of non-crime hate incidents, and institutions leveraging their power to control speech all feed into this narrative. It's an interesting take. The question, however, is whether these examples represent a broad collapse of free expression in Britain or isolated cases weaponized for political discourse. It isn't merely a question of law. It's also one of institutional culture. And the modern workplace, financial institutions, even customer-faced businesses have developed an unprecedented capacity to regulate speech. You only have to be on the phone to some organization that says we will not tolerate bad language, and you suddenly find I haven't used any bad language. Don't shout. And all this sort of stuff, where you suddenly this passive aggressive contempt for the customer has reached a sort of fever pitch. Consider the recent banking controversies where individuals have found their accounts closed for holding politically inconvenient views, like Farage's. There's even a talk of Farage now taking a criminal case against NatWest and Coutts. I would be delighted if that happened. or the bureaucratic chokeholds that dictate what can and cannot be said within the confines of government offices, academia, media outlets. In many cases, it's not the state suppressing speech, but rather private entities using their dominance to enforce ideological conformity. And Vance's criticism doesn't exist in a vacuum. His remarks tie into a broader grievance, one that stems from the perceived failure of the British government to deliver on the promises of Brexit. According to Vance, the democratic will of the people has been overridden by elites who have flung open the doors to millions of unvetted immigrants. Now, here, of course, I leave Vance entirely to his wittering. This claim is steeped in the populist narrative that elites betray their constituents, whether on migration, trade, or foreign policy. But how does this relate to free speech? The argument goes that dissenting voices on these topics are being systematically silenced. The rise of cancellation, debanking, career destruction for politically incorrect opinions are all presented as proof that freedom of expression is under siege. Even the UK's Public Order Act, which introduced buffer zones around abortion clinics, has been framed as encroachment on religious liberties rather than the protective measure for vulnerable individuals. I think it's something different. I think what we're seeing in Britain is a climate of oppression and control, and that climate can be applied in any or the finger of blame can be pointed in any direction. Enter Elon Musk, a man whose recent forays into British media discourse have added fuel to the fire. Musk has openly criticised UK law enforcement for investigating journalists and members of the public over perceived hate speech, and he's decried efforts to regulate content on social media platforms. He's amplified cases where individuals have been prosecuted or reprimanded for controversial opinions, arguing that such restrictions are tantamount to censorship. In doing so, Musk aligns himself with Vance's broader vision of a world where free speech would be an unassailable principle, even at the cost of social cohesion. Yet one must ask, is this truly an American commitment to free speech, or is it simply a reflection of American distaste for European-style governance? The United States, after all, operates under a fundamentally different legal framework for speech, one that prioritizes near absolute freedom, even in cases of misinformation, hate speech, or extremism. The UK, on the other hand, has long upheld a model where speech is weighed against social responsibility, maintaining laws against incitement, defamation, and public disorder. I think it's worth pointing out that for Vance's thesis to be correct, the free speech thing, the suppression of free speech, would have to be linked directly to the failure of Brexit. I am delighted to hear that he thinks Brexit has failed, because I do. But I think that Brexit could never have succeeded. Now, he may have a different view, as indeed may many people who follow GB News. But to then link that to this suppression of free speech, I think these are two separate issues. Not surprisingly, Vance's comments were met with strong resistance. Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius called his speech unacceptable, while other European leaders accused him of hypocrisy, arguing that the US is hardly a bastion of unrestricted expression, given its own corporate and political constraints. But there's a deeper question at play here. Is Europe's approach to free speech a form of necessary balance, or is it overreach? Does restricting public prayer outside an abortion clinic truly constitute the end of free speech? Or is it a common-sense measure to protect individuals from intimidation? Does regulating online hate speech equate to censorship? Or is it a means to prevent the radicalization that has fueled extremism in recent years? And then you have to ask, if these regulations about free speech are supposed to be so pervasive, why aren't they actually efficacious? Organizations like Prevent are, I presume, designed to suppress the free speech of people who are in the process of radicalization, and to stop the development and to prevent terror. It hasn't been very successful, has it? So this is the problem. We have various tropes in this J.D. Vance speech, which he's put together in a very clever package. But I'm afraid once you start examining it, it falls to pieces. What he's got is a series of issues which are separate, and he's joined them together. Ultimately, J.D. Vance's criticism of Britain forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Free speech is not merely about the right to speak, it's also about the environment in which speech occurs. The UK has certainly seen increased restrictions in recent years, some justified, others perhaps more troubling. But the real issue may not be state suppression, it may be the quiet but relentless pressure of institutions, businesses, and bureaucracies enforcing compliance. It's about control. It's not about control in order to get something, it's about control. Control is the object. What J.D. Vance is trying to suggest is that there is a purpose. In other words, it's a conspiracy theory. The problem is, there isn't any purpose. The problem is, this is about power. Is free speech in retreat? Yes, I think so. But it's not necessarily in the way that J.D. Vance describes. The real battle is not simply legal, it's cultural, economic, deeply entrenched in the power structures that have shaped modern life. And so, we have to ask, are we still speaking freely, or have we simply learned to comply?